94.
96 now.
6.
95, 96. There's a lot of clicking going on here just to manage what we're up to.
Yeah, I've got friends trying to get in.
Okay. Well, we're going to make a start. These are just pictures to have a look at to start with. And we're supposed to start at 7:30. We're a few minutes late. Sorry about that, folks. But by way of introduction, Paul McNeil's going to be speaking the presentation, and I'll be changing some slides and managing pictures from this side. Welcome to this, another of the presentations put on by the Clyde Cruising Club. Paul's called this Anchoring in a Blow. So Paul, over to you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Here we go. All stations, all stations, all stations. This is Stornoway Coast Guard, Stornoway Coast Guard, Stornoway Coast Guard for a new gale warning issued by the Met Office for sea areas Malin and Hebrides. Listen now on channel, oh gosh, it's going to have to be channel Zoom. So, thank you all for zooming in, and particular thanks to Vice Commodore Jeff for hosting this presentation and all the previous ones, and a particular thanks for his time, work and expertise in delivering our 4 Cs, and I say this very slowly, our Clyde Cruising Club Chronicles, while we languish in lockdown over the past few weeks and dream of where we might have been in the recent beautiful weather. Anyway, the bad news, as you probably know, is that summer gales in the west of Scotland are not uncommon. But the good news is that they are well forecast and they're usually short-lived. So this evening, I'm going to try and avoid using the term gale and use the term blow. We tend to automatically associate the term gale with a force 8, but the reality is anxiety at anchor could be anything from a force 6 to a force 10, just depending on our experience of anchoring. So I retired from delivering RYA training in the west of Scotland about 2 years ago, and I have been trying to come to terms with the joys and challenges of single-handed sailing. But during the 20 years that I was delivering training, I operated out of mainland Scotland at the beginning and end of the season and out of the Outer Hebrides in the summer months. And I guess that on average, I spent at least 30 nights at anchor each year, plus lots of lunchtime anchorages. Although that adds up to a lot of anchoring, it doesn't mean that I have a monopoly of wisdom or expertise. We have in Scotland many experienced cruising yachtsmen. And if you're an experienced cruising yachtsman that's zoomed in tonight, it's perfectly possible that nothing I say is going to add to the sum of your existing knowledge. And if that's the case, and if you haven't fallen asleep by the end of my presentation, perhaps you might be able to assist with answering any difficult questions later on that I'm not able to answer. Anyway, my presentation's in 4 parts. First of all, do all you can to make your primary anchor secure before thinking about dropping a second hook. 2, I'm going to cover 3 methods of deploying a second anchor in a blow. Thirdly, I'm going to ask and try and answer the question, do angels delight? And fourthly, just touch on the question, does a riding sail help or hinder in a blow? And I hope to be able to deliver all that in about 30 or 40 minutes. So there should be plenty of time for questions, but please remember, I'm just a retired sailing instructor. I'm not a naval architect, I'm not a marine engineer, and I'm not a scientist. So, part 1, make your primary anchor secure. Now, Jeff covered this comprehensively last week. I just want to highlight 3 points that he made. The first is scope, second is spring, and the third is dig it in. Scope, spring, and dig it in. So first of all, scope. The mantra is true. I'm sure you know it already. If in doubt, let it out. It's better on the seabed than in your locker. Now, looking at the diagram, which I see in front of me, and hopefully you all see in front of you, I've tried to draw this to scale. There's a yacht at anchor, and it's a very conscientious skipper that's put out 3 anchors. He's in 5 meters of water, and as you can see, he's got an anchor at scope 3, scope 5, and scope 7. So he's got 15 meters on, 25 meters and 35 meters of chain. And if you focus on the 3 red blobs, you can see at scope 3, the angle between the seabed and the shank of the anchor is, it's a bit iffy. It improves, it diminishes at scope 5 and gets even closer to the horizontal at scope 7. So the more scope we can put out, the better the angle of pull on the anchor, particularly in strong gusts. So that's enough for scope. Secondly, spring. Now, many experienced yachtsmen will keep perhaps 40 meters of chain in their cable and their primary anchor, perhaps even 60 meters. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But as Jeff explained last Tuesday, chain alone is not enough in a good blow. A nylon spring is required to reduce the shock loads in a blow. Chain is certainly needed for its weight and its strength, and chain alone is fine in light to moderate winds. But when it blows hard, we need the protection of nylon. Now, many people will add a short nylon snubber over the bow roller, and that might be an act of kindness for those trying to sleep in the forward cabin. But to get the maximum benefit of reducing shock loads, I totally agree with what Jeff mentioned last week. A good 10 meters or so of nylon back to the cockpit winch will do a lot more for you. Remember the 3 S's for nylon? I used to teach SSS, strong, stretch, and sink. So first of all, as you know, the nylon is very strong. For example, 14 mil nylon has a breaking strength of 4,100 kilogram, 16 mil, 5,300 kilograms, and so on and so on. So it's very strong. Nylon stretches, it can safely stretch up to 20% of its length. Even at 50% load, it can safely stretch up to 20%. However, a couple of minor words of caution. We need to check carefully for there's no chafe on the nylon. We want to avoid it, leaving it on deck in the sunlight when it's not in use. Now, can you have a quick look at these wee diagrams? The first is a short nylon snubber with the bite of chain. I'm not absolutely sure exactly where that short snubber's cleated off, but nevertheless, can we look at the second one, please, Jeff? And there's 2 short nylon, or rather 1 short nylon snubber in the form of a bridle. And I'm guessing that must be a rolling hitch where it's made of. Can we look at some of these devices, please, Jeff? There's quite a variety of them. Various devices to help you with your nylon snubber. And of course, they all have wonderful names. However, as I said, these short nylon snubbers may be kind to people trying to sleep in the forward cabin, eliminating the grunting of the chain on the bow roller. But you get much better protection from a long length of nylon. Now, I have very little interest in these short nylon snubbers because my own, and it's only a personal preference, my own personal preference has to have 2 anchors and cables with 50% chain and 50% nylon, as I prefer to anchor close inshore in shallow water, and each cable has 20 meters of chain permanently connected to 20 meters of nylon. And for an overnight anchor, I always have all chain in the water with nylon over the bow roller. Although I might have less than that, might have chain over the bow roller for a short lunchtime stop. So that's strong, that's stretch, and thirdly, dig it in. But the question is, the next question is, how hard do we have to dig it in to be safe when it blows up? Now, as Jeff said last Tuesday, it's important that you increase the revs very slowly, and you should wait until the cable's fully stretched before taking transits ashore at 90 degrees. Now, the textbooks line up a telegraph pole with the gable end of a house or whatever, but the reality in many Scottish anchorages is that we have to line up a boat stanchion with a single clear mark ashore. And we ask the question, are we holding or dragging? When the stern of the yacht's swinging about, it can be quite tricky to make this judgment. So we need to be patient and take our time. What's the difference between the yacht dragging back and us swinging about? And the other vexed question is, this isn't a vexed question. We need to know the maximum forecast wind overnight. Should we go to full revs astern? This is the vexed question. Now, this is a great area, but I had a very good reason to going for some great lengths to try and make this issue as black and white as possible. And the simple reason was that as a sailing instructor, I needed to be able eventually to sleep, to at least get some sleep at anchor and ablow, as I had to function fully the following day, as I had to get my trainees through a syllabus. And over the 20 years, the RYA syllabus grew arms and legs. That was particularly the case for the day skipper syllabus, and many instructors found it quite a challenge to deliver everything in 5 days. Now, to try and be more realistic about it, if you're sailing for pleasure and you have a sleepless night at anchor or have an epic, you can normally rest and recover the following day. You can chill out in the boat, you can go ashore for a walk or whatever. Worst is you might have to modify your sailing plans. Maybe lose a day in your cruising plans, but basically the cruising yachtsmen, most cruising yachtsmen are only going to experience a real blow very occasionally, and you can normally cope with a sleepless night. So what did I do? Because I couldn't cope with sleepless nights, I invested in an anchor watch strain gauge device, which is best understood by looking at the photos, and what you can see now is the load cell strain device. The anchor warps taken back to a cockpit winch, just to give more room on the foredeck there. It could have been round the cleat. And you can see there's a cable also going aft, and that goes to the control box at the cockpit. And this is the magic box. Now, the good thing about this magic box is I didn't have to stay awake all night in the interest of science, because I could press a button in the morning and that would give me the highest peak load overnight. I also kept my masthead wind instrument on overnight, and in the morning pressed another magic button to get the maximum overnight gust. And after a lot of trial and error in blows of different strengths, I was able to build up a profile of westbound adventure, a Sigma 33 at anchor in various wind strengths. So a quick look at that, please, Jeff. Yeah. So on the left, you've got the anchor watch reading in kilograms, and the red line was the wind generated forces. But all this, of course, in sheltered anchorages, not in exposed anchorages. Beaufort scale along the bottom. And obviously, I had to test the revs astern on the engine. And I don't want to go into any great detail about that at the moment, but it did give me an approximate picture. Some experts looking at this graph were surprised how small how low many of the readings were. I'm not a scientist, but I can only take a guess that that might have been as when all these readings were taken, I had an awful lot of nylon out, which absorbs a lot of the force of the wind, particularly the gusts. So those are the three things I wanted to emphasize from Jeff's comprehensive presentation: scope, spring, and dig it in. So moving on now to the second part, the forkmoor. Can we go back? Can we take all that off, Jeff? And go back to myself, sorry, can we go to myself sitting at my reel inside my house, sitting at my reel table, playing with my, about to play with my toy boat in a few minutes. And the question, of course, now is moving on to part 2. When should I drop a second hook? Well, 2 or 3 years ago in Stornoway Harbour, I met John and Helen Anderson, who are honorary members of the Clyde Cruising Club, because some years ago they did a little circumnavigation. It wasn't a circumnavigation of the Cumbries, and it wasn't a circumnavigation of Arran, it was a global circumnavigation on their 20-foot yacht, I think. Anyway, some years after that, back home, they changed from sail to power, and they still delight in cruising the west of Scotland. Or at least they did. They were still afloat when I met them 2 or 3 years ago in Stornoway Harbour, and I hope they're both still well at the moment. But in a previous correspondence, John told me that he survived with one anchor down. He survived an extreme gale in North Bay and Barra. It was overnight on the 12th, 13th of June in the millennium year of 2000, and his handheld anemometer was off the scale. So the next morning, when he had recovered, he phoned the staff at Barra Airport, which is about 2 miles north of North Bay, and they were able to tell him that the highest hourly average was 54 knots, and the highest recorded gust was 83 knots. And that was with one anchor down, and he didn't drag. So we need to raise the question, when do we actually need to drop that second hook? Another example, about 25 years ago, the late Professor John Knox, whom some of you know was both a cruising yachtsman and a scientist, he dragged his anchor in Ardnamur in a force 6, and the following year his anchor held in Gometra North Harbour in a force 10. And because he was a scientist, he wanted to get to the bottom of this. Why did my anchor drag in a force 6 in Ardnamur and hold in Gometra North, in the west of Mull, in a force 10? Both of these experiences frightened him because both are very small anchorages, and if you drag, you're on the rocks very soon. For anybody who's not familiar with Ardnamur or Gometra North Harbour, it's probably about the same size as Cala Harbour and the Kyles of Bute. So they're lovely anchorages, but very tight. Anyway, being a scientist, he then decided to spend years, in fact, lots and lots of hours over several years carrying out scientific experiments, some of which Jeff mentioned last week. He measured the holding power of various anchors. He went into catenaries of chain, weight of chain, snatching at anchors, stretcher anchor cables, and many of his articles were published in the yachting magazines. Now, a lot of it was heavy reading because it was heavy science. Much of it went over the top of my head. Certainly his mathematical formula went straight over the top of my head, but nevertheless, I found his conclusions very convincing. So the only advice I can offer is do everything you can to make your primary anchor secure. And if you are still worried that your anchor might drag, then that's when you want to think about dropping a second hook from the bow in the Fort Moor, which I'll try and demonstrate with this model with my toy boat in a minute. But let me give you, before I do that, let me give you one other possible option. Some years ago, I was anchored in Loch Skippert. Well, I've often been anchored in Loch Skippert, and as you know, there are very charming, idyllic pools. Now, I was in the one next to the Wizard Pool, Coolis Moor, I think it's called. And there was a forecast of a northeasterly force 8 overnight. By the way, there is a most enchanting narrow passage between Wizard Pool and Coolis Moor. And I think the Admiralty charts have this passage as drying, but those of you who have Antares charts will know that in fact it is a good clean passage there. I certainly wouldn't recommend you trying to tack your yacht through that passage, but it's a good clean passage thanks to Bob Bradfield and his Antares charts. And thanks to Bob, not just for this, but for his other 522 charts in the west of Scotland. It really is an amazing gift for the cruising yachtsman just now and for generations to come. I'm going to digress very, very slightly when I say I think there's now a new challenge for the adventurous cruising yachtsman, and that is to find an idyllic Hebridean anchorage which Bob hasn't already surveyed. Now, if you manage to do that, once you've found your new idyllic anchorage, you've got a difficult decision to make. If you want to keep it as your secret anchorage, then shh, don't tell Bob about it, or he'll go and survey it, and then everybody will know about it. But anyway, that's a decision that you've got to make. And if you were looking at if you had the chance to look at the roll of slides before my presentation, there is one such idyllic anchorage there that Bob doesn't know about, but I'm not going to tell you about that. Well, I might tell you about it if you bribe me with enough golden liquid at some point, but for the moment, I'll get off that digression and get back to this northeasterly gale in Loch Skippet. And the anchor, the primary anchor, was well dug in, and I knew from experience we were absolutely good for this gale, but I had 4 RYA trainees with me, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to demonstrate the Fort Moor. And I think from start to finish, putting that second hook down probably took us about 30 minutes with all the trimming and tweaking until we were happy. But a very interesting thing happened on a neighbouring yacht. A single-handed yachtsman got into his dinghy with a long line. He rowed ashore. He secured the long line ashore, rowed it back to the yacht, made it off somewhere on the bow, not under full tension, but just slightly slack. So he had created a line ashore as a preventer. I mention that because it's something you might want to consider, but only if you're snugly tucked up in your anchorage before the full force of this big blow arrives. And obviously you need to be at anchor sufficiently close inshore to be able to do this. Okay, so that's line ashore is a possibility. Right, let me get down to the business of the Fort Moor and dropping that second anchor. So I'm going to move my device away and tilt it in the hope that you will be able to see what I've been doing, languishing in lockdown, playing with bits of wood and string and various other household devices. Here, my boat's aground, but if I do that, it's suddenly afloat. Jeff, could you give me a thumbs up if everything is visible? Oh, good, right. Oh, this, by the way, this is the desirable end result. 2 anchors down from the bow, roughly about an angle of about 40 degrees. The question, however, is how do we get there from the first anchor? So let me get rid of one of these anchors. Oops. So you just can't get the crew these days. Somebody's not tied that knot on the tripping line tightly enough. Anyway, it's amazing what picture hooks can do if you use your imagination. Okay. So we have, well, this is the starboard anchor. We have done all the things necessary to be. Oh, I've lost a picture. Are we back in business there, Jeff? Yeah, good. Okay. So there are 3 possible methods, and one is using the dinghy, but wouldn't recommend this method unless you're in your anchorage before it really blows up. Because there's a fair bit of work in organising the dinghy. You want to organise it so that in the dinghy at the bottom is the bitter end of your nylon cable, all flaked out, chain all flaked out, then your anchor. And you definitely want to try and put a tripping line, call it what you want, buoy, float on the end. And then you either row or motor all that hardware out to your designated chosen spot. I'll just swap this anchor over to the port side. And just visually, you try and drop it in the appropriate place, then make your way, letting it out, make your way back to the yacht. make it secure, and then begins the process of trial and error, suck it and see, taking in and letting out on both cables until we're equidistant between both of them. But don't do that. Fair bit of work involved, and I don't recommend that unless you've got plenty of time at your disposal and it's not blowing too hard. Right, so second method, let's assume that this second cable is tucked up somewhere on board and is now being prepared. Fall back and plenty of scope on your existing cable, and you're going to use the engine to motor over. You can see where this is, of course, remember, because you've buoyed the anchor. You can see, just imagine that's buoyed, and you can see where it is. So you're going to motor over to the designated spot. Now, when you're doing that, you don't want to put too much strain on the cable, so let plenty of scope out. And I think it would be prudent to have somebody on the port side deck with a boat hook, just to make sure that that warp is not going to get tangled with the keel or the rudder or anything nasty like that. And once you're in the correct position, you drop the second hook from the bow of the yacht. Sorry if I'm labouring this to those of you who have done all this before. And then you fall back and play about until you're equidistant on both cables. The third method, and this became my preferred method, was simply to dig in and be happy with the first cable, and then simply buoy the bitter end of the first cable, dump it in the water, so we can see both the bitter end of the cable with a float and the crown of the anchor with a float. Motor over to the desired spot, drop your second anchor from the bow, dig it in till you're happy that it's holding rather than dragging. And then with plenty of scope, motor over here, collect this one with the boat hook. And again, process of trial and error, adjusting both cables until they're both looking good at a good angle. And of course, apart from the obvious advantage of 2 anchors down instead of 1, this significantly reduces the amount of swinging or yawing that the boat does at anchor. Just before I leave this section, hope to have a wee light-hearted break before I go on to do Angel's Delight. Just a quick checklist. Most of you would instinctively do all this anyway, before settling down to sleep or to attempt to sleep through your overnight blow. You want to secure the deck, move all halyards away from the mast, make sure the tiller or wheel is secured. Don't leave the dinghy astern afloat. Bring the dinghy on board. You can deflate it and stow it, or you can lash it down on the foredeck of the coach roof while it's still afloat. Of course, you want to raise your anchor ball and prepare the anchor light. You might want to consider bringing the bitter end of one or both anchors on deck and attaching a float to them. And finally, once you've done all that, you can go below. And to assist you with the process of sleeping through this blow, I would recommend, personal recommendation of 2 items of equipment. The first is a 6-letter word beginning with W. And the second piece of equipment are 2 words. The first is a 3-letter word beginning with E, and the second is a 5-letter word beginning with P. So I will leave you to work that out for yourself. Now, this anchoring business can be a bit heavy, maybe a bit dry. So before going on to my third section of Do Angel's Delight, I'm going to attempt a couple of little, very short anecdotes to make the bitter pill more sweet, perhaps. The first anecdote is the porridge pot, and it dates to my very early years as a sailing instructor. We were anchored somewhere in the Clyde. It might have been Glencallum Bay, but it doesn't really matter where it was. The following morning, I was on breakfast duty, And as I was doing the breakfast dishes, I wanted to keep my trainees ticking over, keep them going. So I think I had 2 day skippers at the saloon table doing sums like passage planning or tidal heights or something. And I had 2 novices doing comp crew. And while I was doing the dishes, they were in the cockpit, and I was throwing some boat names at them, and they had to point to them. Really difficult stuff like bower stern or master boom. But it got even more difficult, things like cleats and winches and things like that. Anyway, it came to scrubbing the porridge pot, and it was half full of water, and it was pretty gooey and messy. So I handed the porridge pot up to one of my trainees and said, "Could you please toss that overboard?" And she did exactly that. What I should have said, of course, was, "Would you toss the contents overboard and return the pot to me?" So my early lesson was, think about your instructions. And if you're taking friends or friends of friends sailing, and somebody is a novice, you don't want them hanging about. You want to give them useful things to do. So just be very careful when you're giving them important, useful things to do, like coming alongside or anchoring. Think about your instructions very carefully. Anyway, the second wee anecdote comes from the beautiful island of Vatersay. And about a couple of weeks ago, a neighbour of mine on Vatersay told his cows to self-isolate. And as you can see, one of his cows took it very seriously. So there we go, a self-isolating cow. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the third section, which is the question, do angels delight? So I think perhaps, Jeff, could you tell the self-isolating cow to go away? In fact, could you put me back on the screen for a bit, please? Is that, oh, sorry, did you have to go through these in sequence, Jeff, when you do that? You do? Oh, my apologies, right. Okay, I'll not ask you to do that again then. Okay.
That's right. I can swap backwards and forwards wherever you need.
Okay. Right. So here's a wee 30-second quiz for you folks. There are several names for the heavy weight that some cruising yachtsmen put down the anchor road, apart from Angel. I can think of 1, 2, 3. I can think of 5 of them. If any of you can know of a 6th one, you can tell us about it later. So the first name has 4 letters, and it begins with a C for Charlie. How do we think about that? What could that be? The second has 6 letters and begins with K for kilo. A third has 8 letters and begins with S for sugar. A fourth has 2 names and both begin with R. The first has 4 letters and the second R has 5 letters. And a 5th name begins with a B, B for Bravo, and it has 5 letters. And if we add Angel to that, that's 6 different names altogether. Okay, see how you get on. Here's the answers. C for Charlie is the chum. And K for kilo is the killet, if I got my spelling for that correctly. It's got 6 letters. S for sugar is the sentinel. The 2 R's is the road rider. And the B is, I've forgotten what the B is. The buddy, yes. Buddy, road rider, sentinel, killet, chum, and Angel. So anyway, with apologies to Jeff for having to shift about in the diagrams, can we look at the theory of sending one of these devices down an anchor cable? Yeah, well, we've already looked at the top drawing. In the lower one, we've got the yacht in 5 meters of water, and he's very, very worried and anxious. He sent 2 angels down. And as you can see, the red one is closer to the crown of the anchor, and the green one's closer to the bow. Now, the theory is that if you look at the red one, the yacht, when the yacht swings at anchor, it should dance around the red angel instead of dancing around the anchor, or perhaps even dancing around the green angel. Sending the red angel down only moves the bow forward a tiny fraction. Sending the green one down moves the bow slightly more forward than the red one. But the important point about all this is this is only useful, it can be useful in a crowded anchorage where swinging room is limited. That's the good news. The bad news is to be really effective, the angel has to be very, very heavy. Because once it blows strong enough and the cables are fully stretched, then the yacht will still dance around its anchor rather than dance around the angel. This is one of the things that the late Professor Knox went into in some scientific detail, and I have to agree with his conclusion that to be effective, an angel needs to be very heavy indeed and can never be more effective than extra chain on the seabed of the same weight. Now, I did a very crazy experiment many years ago, and there should be a photograph of that coming up. Oh, sorry. You'll just take a few seconds to look at the various devices that some yachtsmen send down the anchor rod. And maybe you could now look at my crazy, one more, the chum. And my crazy experiment of binding up heavy anchor chain. Well, this weighed 35 kilograms, and I can assure you it was very heavy to deploy and extremely difficult to recover. So if you can, if you've got the sea room, always let out more chain on the seabed rather than send down an angel, in my opinion. However, this still leaves the problem of blowing up in a crowded anchorage. For example, if you think of how popular Poldorin is because of its close proximity to Oban, in the summer months, you could easily have 20 yachts, even more, at anchor. And crowded anchorages can be absolutely fine, very pleasant social occasions. Poldorin, you can even walk ashore to the pub, as you know, potter about, do some fishing. Kids can play in the dinghy. Everything is very pleasant and sociable. But once it blows up to 4, 6, 2 or 3 of those 20 yachts will, for one reason or another, will drag their anchor. And I know it's very easy to give advice. It's more difficult to take the advice. My advice is try and avoid crowded anchorages. If you can't avoid a crowded anchorage, if you can't up anchor and go somewhere else, perhaps you could consider lifting the anchor and anchoring upwind of others. Anchoring upwind of the other boats will often mean you're anchoring in very shallow water. So obviously you need to do your tidal sums for that. But if you can't go elsewhere and you can't anchor upwind of the others, and you have resigned yourself to the possibility of others dragging down on you at 2 in the morning, you might want to consider, let's hope, by the way, in a crowded anchorage, you've put a tripping line on your anchor. You might even want to consider having a float ready at the bitter end of your anchor, because you've got to think about untangling the spaghetti the following morning. It can be quite an ordeal, and sometimes you might have to let your cable go altogether in order to untangle it. So to answer the question, do angels delight? In my opinion, they delight very seldom. Nearly finished. My 4th and final part, only take a few minutes. I'm just wanting to raise the question, does a riding sail help or hinder in a blow? And could we have the photo, please, Jeff? my first experience of experimenting with a riding sail was with a storm jib up the backstay, and it had the effect of the anchor dragged. Now, I can't remember exactly whether that anchor was properly dug in before I experimented with the storm jib, but that worried me. And then sometime later, I asked my sailmaker to make up a very small bespoke riding sail, which I experimented with. And looking at that photograph, I think I eventually came to the conclusion that small riding sail was more effective lower down than what you see in the photo in front of you. But it was simply hoisted up the backstay with, I can't remember whether main halyard or topping lift. Obviously, had to put a downhaul on the tack and secure that to a strong point in the cockpit. It was piston hanks on the backstay, and I just led one sheet from the clew. It went a good distance forward and secured, tensioned up somewhere on the bow, trial and error. Oh, can I just say in my defense that there is an anchor ball flying there. If you look between the mast and the forestay, the anchor ball had actually collapsed and was twirling round in the wind, and the camera caught it when it was flat on. So please don't wrap my knuckles for not flying the anchor ball on that occasion. I was in the dinghy to take that photograph, and it obviously wasn't blowing too strong at that point. But I did carry out some limited experiments with the riding sail when it anchored on strong winds, and I measured the arc through which the stern swings with the hand-bearing compass. The riding sail had the effect of reducing the swinging circle a small amount by approximately 15 degrees. But what I think was more significant was that the yacht swung about at anchor more sedately. Some yachts will dance about, dance a stately minuet. Others will do a live bossa nova or cha-cha, depending on the underwater profile of the yacht and various other things. But the riding sail did tame the motion of the yacht, so I can only assume that taming the motion of the yacht reduced the tension at the point of maximum swing or maximum yaw. But I readily acknowledge that experimenting with a riding sail is not something that the average cruising yachtsman would want to think about. You would need to be spending an awful lot of time at anchor before you would want to go through that kind of experiment. So there ends my 4 parts, and back to Jeff. Oh yes, we want to get sailing whenever the lockdown, let's go sailing whenever this lockdown is unlocked.
Right, well, that was really great, Paul. We've still got everybody on mute at the moment. We've got a couple of questions that have come up already on the chat part, so we can deal with those first, and then we can perhaps ask if anybody else has got any other questions. So David has asked, what happens when you get some wind veering with 2 anchors out? I guess it might be the same question if that wind was backing.
Well, the bad news is your work the following day to recover these 2 is greatly enhanced. The cables will be twisted, so you've got more work. If the wind is forecast to veer, I suggest you want to put your starboard anchor, your best anchor, out to starboard. If the wind is forecast to back, I suggest you want to put your best anchor out to port. But the cables will get tangled with a veer, and that will involve extra time and effort in untangling the cables the following morning, which is one of the reasons why you might want to consider, if it's practical, a line ashore as an alternative to a second anchor.
Okay, so let's open up for questions, but we've got 100 people sitting here, so it's going to be tricky to manage who's asking questions. And in fact, there were a few people tried also to join us, but we've got a limit of 100 on this account on Zoom. So you who were here first had the best seats. So any questions for Paul? Frida, I can see your hand. You unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay, I have. Can I go right back to the beginning when you was just talking about anchoring and not taking the weight of the chain on your anchor winch? We always just, in lighter winds, put a chain hook on and then bring it up over the bow and put it onto a cleat. But you're describing something that goes back to the stern?
Well, what I'm saying, light to moderate winds, all chain cable is good, and there's nothing wrong with leaving the chain over the bow roller in light to moderate winds. What I'm saying tonight, and what Jeff was saying on previous occasions, is when it blows up, you definitely want to add a length of nylon, and because of the stretch properties of nylon, it can stretch up to 20%. The longer that nylon warp is, then the better the shock, the more shock loads I think it would hold. But Jeff might be in a better position to answer that because it's his practice. My practice is always to have 20 meters of nylon on my cable, but Jeff might want to answer that one about taking the warp back to the cockpit winch.
My question was really not, I understand about the nylon and the stretch. I know about that. It's where you're attaching it to on your boat. Because, I mean, our boat tends to, if we take anything off center, she tends to veer around a lot, sail around her chain. So you've got that coming from your main anchor rod. And are you bringing it up?
Are you talking about the nylon snubber where it goes over the bow? Okay.
Oh, right. Sorry, the diagram doesn't show it going over the bow. So I thought you were describing something.
No, it doesn't. And it's just a case of poor diagram, really. The best place is to put it over the bow. And if you've got 2 slots on the bow, that's the best. Yeah, but if you've only got a single slot over the bow and you've got your chain out there, then you don't want to mix your chain in the same slot as your nylon. Otherwise, you're going to chop the nylon around as the chain slaps. So you may have to take it over a cleat. But if that's going to cause the boat to flop all over the place, then you're going to have to figure out what the best system is. And it could be that you want to take a second rope on your nylon to give you some swing to bring it onto the center line or something like that. Yeah. You might have to, in effect, jury rig something.
Yeah, no, we always bring it onto the center line. It was just that diagram showed it. I thought it was going round the hull of the boat and back to the stern or something. I didn't understand that. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a couple of more questions on the chat here. Cameron would like us to go back and have a look at that graph again, Paul, and he wants to ask you some questions about that. So let me just share that as well, and then we can have a look at that. So there's the graph back on the screen. Cameron, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, I'm not sure if you can hear me now. Yeah, no, it's just I was really interested to find the graphs that you'd found, and the readings are much lower than I expected. So that looks fantastic. Can you go through? I never quite picked up how you derived those figures. Could you possibly talk that through, please?
I can try, Cameron. It was the anchor watch strain gauge device that recorded the forces on the anchor on a single anchor cable, and it was the masthead wind instrument. The following morning, I'm really just looking at the maximum overnight strain on the cable, and the following morning, I'm looking at the maximum gust of wind and correlating the two. And then measuring that against how many revs astern I need to go. Obviously, a separate experiment was to have the anchor watch strain gauge device when I'm going astern in the engine at different rates and making a note of that. But if these readings, let's assume they're all under reading, I think it would still be valid for my own boat. For example, I eventually came to the conclusion for a force 8, I need to gradually and slowly go to full revs astern. And if we're holding at full revs astern, I felt I could relax at night. If it was a force 9 or 10, then I would need to motor forward slightly and try and go astern at a couple of knots to put a shock load on the system.
Okay.
Does that help explain it any better?
It does indeed. That's a really useful graph to see. Thank you very much for showing that.
Okay, we've got another question about, so that's about that. What was the recommended angle between the two anchors when you had the forked moor, Paul?
About 40 degrees or 45 degrees. I think one expert, I think I read in an article somewhere that ideally speaking, you should have the same distance between the two anchors as your scope. But I haven't, I've just done it visually, suck it and see.
Okay, thanks. And Boyd asks, have you anchored in Glen Bay and Herta?
I have failed to anchor in Glen Bay and Hirta many times, and yes, along with many other people. I can only guess that the one anchor that might hold in Glen Bay is a fisherman anchor, but I've never had a fisherman anchor on board to try that out. I know of yachtsmen who have had a nice experience in Glen Bay, but in mild conditions, calm conditions, and I suspect they're just anchored to the weight, simply to the weight of their ground tackle, and but it just doesn't dig in there. I once had a major epic there in Glen Bay, and if Boyd hasn't read my story, I'll happily email it to him.
He also asks, what pattern of anchor do you use for your bower anchor?
The latest generation of high holding anchors are absolutely excellent. And there's a raft of them. There must be at least 5 or 6 of them that will do approximately an equal job. I was very happy for many years with my spade. Then I lost it. That's a long story. I won't go into that. And then the late John Knox asked me to trial one of his own Knox anchors, which I did, and I've been very happy with that Knox anchor since losing my spade anchor. The Knox anchor is similar but not identical to the Rockna.
And then we've got a question from Jamie. How do you manage a situation where there's a strong offshore wind, but the seabed drops away fairly quickly, or there's poor holding? Is it better to tie the bow or the stern to the shore in this situation? So strong offshore wind, steeply to, and poor holding.
Oh, well, I've never been in a situation whereby I've never been in a real blow with poor holding. If you were in that situation, I think you might, for your own peace of mind or for your own preparedness or readiness, you would need to play about with some of the toys below. There's the echo sounder alarm, there's the GPS radius alarm, there is you could always set a waypoint with your chart plotter. But remember, if you're leaving your chart plotter on all night, it can certainly eat up the boat batteries. Of course, the purpose of these alarms is just to avoid having an anchor watch on deck by the crew through the night. You can at least, if you can trust one of these alarms, then you can at least have everybody down below warm and reasonably comfortable, but obviously prepared to clear out if the poor holding goes against you.
Okay, any other questions from anyone? That's all the written ones. If you want to ask a question, unmute yourself and ask. Deathly silence.
Hi there, Denver speaking here. I have a question, if that's possible.
Go ahead, Denver.
Hi, what advice would you give for those that are starting out anchoring? I suppose it's my wife and I, and we're kind of fairly new to sailing, but we want to try and get out and anchor a bit more. if we can at all this year. So what would you say, or what advice would you give as we start off on that?
Are you a member of the Clyde Cruising Club or any other sailing club?
No, not. We sail out of Ballycastle, and unfortunately, there's no social activities there or any club activities. No.
I see. That's difficult. One of the advantages of being in a sailing club like the Clyde Cruising Club is they have cruises and company, and apart from the social side, there's always plenty of people around to advise you. You obviously need to just take it by slow stages, anchoring in very calm conditions first. It does. You can't learn everything from a textbook. You've actually got to go and do it. And the difficult thing is having the convenience of visitors' moorings and marinas all over the place. It does require, if you're new, it does require quite an effort to push yourself out of that comfort zone. But
I think another bit of advice is to anchor as often as you can. So make a stop for lunch or a cup of tea or something like that. Unless you're in a hurry to get somewhere, deploy your anchor, put your anchor down and anchor, even if it's only for half an hour, 20 minutes or something. Do it and then just get the experience of doing it and get the feel for what goes right and what goes wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Can I make a Can I suggest that people anchor when it's easy, because you don't want to be learning to anchor when it's difficult.
Exactly. that's really what I was saying by saying.
No, that's build up your confidence with easy anchoring, because the last thing you want to do is to try and anchor in a force 10 in the kelp in Canna Harbour for the first time. It won't work.
Thanks, Boyd.
Anyone else?
Can I make a wee point?
Norman.
Yes.
Norman, go ahead.
Right. What I was going to say was that we tend to anchor in some of the more out of the way places where the information is a bit missing. And I have found that using a fish finder is brilliant for giving me an idea of what the bottom is like. I noticed that neither Paul nor yourself has mentioned choosing the actual ground that you're anchoring on. And I think that is very important. I find that we can, with the fish finder, I can look around. Obviously, if you're anchoring in sand, it's no bother. But if you're anchoring in a muddy bottom, the chances are that the water, you can't actually see the bottom. And the fish finder will show you where there are patches of weed and clear patches. So I would recommend the use of a fish finder.
Could I come in?
Yes, go ahead, Clive.
Well, I'd made the original notes about the types of anchor, and over the many years, and like Paul, I have a spade, and it's a very lightweight aluminium spade, which has held me very nicely in 40 knots in St Kilda, albeit I had 12 times the amount of depth out in chain. And but I think these modern anchors, particularly the spade, I've twice now I've anchored in Canna where people have been dragging, and my anchor's just gone right through the weed. And it seems to, these new anchors, the angle makes a difference, because it would appear that anchorages are becoming more and more weed infested and making it more difficult to anchor. I would say that if we go for a 2-week cruise, we anchor possibly 20 times to 25 times in a fortnight. We maybe anchor 2-3 times a day and avoid going in, to marinas. They're too expensive,